So, you've been inside of investment. You've been inside some of the biggest institutional investors in California and Alaska. But you also have spent a great deal of your time studying the Arctic and the investment opportunities there. So, just as an initial question, we all hear that there are these great opportunities to invest in the Arctic. But as someone who's been inside the largest institutional investors, is the Arctic right now on their radar? And if so, in what ways?
Sure. So great to see everybody here. Hopefully I'll project well. I'm a brass instrument player. So when you play brass instruments, projecting is one of the objectives.
What do you play?
Trumpet, trombone, tuba.
Tuba, yes.
So I think the first thing, so the short answer to your question is largely no. That is, the Arctic is not on the radar screen for most institutional investors today. However, that's changing, and I want to provide a context. There are sort of three types of institutions that would be interested in investing in a region, including the Arctic. And they each have very distinctive roles. And they're sort of like, the three legs of a stool. Two of them are sort of more developed than the third. And what are these three legs? One is government investment. Well, governments do invest, in the Arctic for various infrastructure. The second are companies, industrial companies. Think of mining companies. And the third class is institutional investors. So the institutional investment leg has been missing. And largely because opportunities have not been packaged in a form that have appealed to institutional investors. So part of this discussion is that, well, one, why are institutional investors interesting at all? If you have governments and you have industrial companies, do you need institutional investment? Let me give you an idea of scale. Institutional investors can provide scale. Scale in a way that governments, frankly, and industrial companies can never do. Governments and industrial companies have other roles, critically important. But when you think of, I was just in Norway, for instance, and a big industrial company mining project could involve $1 billion of investment. How large is the Norwegian sovereign fund? It's $1 trillion in size. It's $1 trillion in size. So you sort of think that $1 billion is about as large of an investment as you get from almost any industrial company. So if you want to have scale impact, the institutional investment community matters. You can provide scale in a way that the governments and generally the industrial companies can never do. You kind of abstract to an extreme form of this, a very different place, Africa. So in Africa, does Africa inherently have $1 trillion of infrastructure investment need? Absolutely. If you had $1 trillion, could you invest it profitably in Africa today? No way. It is not packaged up in a way that is digestible, that makes sense, that can generate the cash flows that Mead was talking about, the regularized cash flows that can appeal to investors. So there's a difference. So part of the role which I'm trying to chase down, and this was a challenge we had, especially at CalPERS, was that we actually have to craft what the opportunities are, and I'll give you some examples of that. So in other places in the world, the opportunities are packaged and ready to go for institutional investors. And in the Arctic, that generally is not the case. We have to do our own packaging. At CalPERS, we actually ran into a problem with this. We were, at one time, the most important institutional investor in private equity in the world. And what happened was my staff, who were a great staff, but they became used to all the opportunities we thought coming to us. It was like going deer hunting, but you would only, if the deer were knocking on your door, those were the ones that you hunted. But what we found is that actually the best deer may not be the ones knocking on your door. You might actually have to go and find them. You might, that's essentially what we have to do in the Arctic. Go over some examples of what these are, but I'd say that the institutional investors are new to Arctic investing. They are the third leg that will make the Arctic development actually work. That governments alone and industrial companies alone will not have the capital or incentives to be able to actually create scale infrastructure developments in a way that's actually compelling. So it's a third leg that's missing, but it's an exciting sort of addition. So if we can attract them in a way that it gives governments and industrial companies sort of new authority and new potential.
Very interesting. So just sort of thinking about and trying to digest one thing you said is that institutional investors crave or need regular payments because they have, people who have pensions who need to get paid. So they're always looking for that. That seems like it would be both a challenge and an opportunity. Maybe an opportunity you hear a lot today. I'm also thinking about something we've discussed earlier, which is today you hear a lot about negative bond yields and how no one can find a place to put their money. I mean, you can't put a toll road per se, I think is one thing we mentioned. In the Arctic, there just aren't enough people, but what sort of opportunities specifically do you see institutional investors potentially getting involved in? Because I talk to mining companies a lot, and they tell me they need investors. They want investment. They don't have a connected grid in the Arctic, or they don't have roads. I mean, is it potential that we'll see institutional investors collaborating with resource companies, not necessarily to do a traditional investment in the resource company, but maybe to provide some sort of component that a resource project could help pay for? Is that something we might see? Or what sort of opportunities, I guess I'm wondering, are there?
So I wanted to distinguish among 5 Arctic themes that we're seeing in general, and then what are the nature of these projects that can be interesting for institutional investors. Because as you point out, infrastructure can have a number of forms. Some infrastructure, roads are a good example, they can be incredibly valuable for an economy, but they will not necessarily produce regularized cash flows. So they could be good for a government to do, government-financed infrastructure. It can be different than things which the private sector could do, and I'll go into some of those examples. So when I think of 5 major themes for projects that we are evaluating, and this is true across the Arctic, these categories are the following. One is logistics, and the logistics certainly includes seaports, maritime infrastructure, also air infrastructure. The air infrastructure gets the Great Circle Route, for instance, when we think of Alaska, becomes much more interesting as a very natural role for Alaska between East Asia and the rest of North America, something that actually Secretary Seward anticipated when he purchased Alaska in 1867. And communications. Communications infrastructure can also be an important area. So that's in the logistics category. Second is energy. The Arctic is a source of energy. It's also a place where transportation is changing. The role of fuels is changing. So, for instance, with maritime fuels, moving from diesel to other fuels, it's a big area. A lot of potential investment. We're looking, for instance, the the role for different types of liquid fuel, including LNG. We see cases of hydrogen as a fuel. We see a case of a re-refined oil meeting IMO 2020 standards as a possibility. So you start seeing that the move away from diesel itself for maritime purposes and for heating, another big deal. Third, mining. The Arctic is important it's critically important for the development of the Arctic region. Greenland is a future superpower. We hope. A lot of people hope. And even aside from Greenland, mining is a very big deal. Greenland, is the potential for Greenland with rare earth elements is potentially greater than what exists in China, which produces today 95% of the rare earth elements of the world. Experiences, tourism. This is sustainable tourism. Imagine that this is already a pretty significant thing. Think of the cruise ship industry. From an environmental perspective, the cruise ship industry might be the worst industry in the world. So it's when you have problems and challenges, that creates an interesting investment opportunity for changing things. And food is also it's actually a growth area, from fishing to potentially agriculture. Canada actually is a leader in four-season agriculture with the use of greenhouses and times when using inexpensive energy sources for growing things in off seasons when it's dark outside. So I'm actually pretty enthusiastic about what I'm seeing. I want to go back to the re-refinery concept for something to give you an example of where you have to go out hunting and make your own infrastructure sometimes. So the Clean Harbors of Boston developed what's called a re-refinery, taking spent motor oil from trucks and from cars. And in the re-refining process, a re-refinery is a $30 million type enterprise, and it's about 1/10 the footprint of a regular refinery, and you re-refine out the sulfur and other potential particulate matter. What's interesting about it is that the re-refined oil meets IMO 2020, or International Maritime Standards, that kicked in a few weeks ago. The shock in the industry is that even though the standard was sort of set up to be implemented a few weeks ago, almost no one is adhering to IMO 2020 standards. So a number of governments, particularly in the Arctic region, such as Norway, not happy about this, looking to impose stiff fines on maritime transit for ones who are not meeting IMO 2020 standards. A re-refinery can be put up in 12 to 14 months. This is interesting. 30 million gallons of spent motor oil to be converted into re-refined oil that can be used without retrofitting a ship. So I use this as an example of one where the project itself is something that has to be developed. This is something that the opportunity is there. When you explain it, it's pretty straightforward to see. An institutional investor, once it's packaged for them, can leap onto the opportunity. If you wanted to have a series of 5 to 10 re-refineries across the Arctic region, that's something that can be packaged in a way that makes sense for an institutional investor. Notice what I had to do for that, though. We had to locate the technology, we had to create the case for it, we had to define where the cash flows would come, and then we can package it in a way that makes sense for institutional investors. This is not something that was just out there for an institutional investor to do. So I look at this as the need, and maybe the potential cash flows are pretty great in the Arctic along these themes, but we're going to have to develop them. And that's going to be our biggest challenge.
Okay, and that's really interesting what you're saying too. I mean, two of the things I heard you lay out there were, there are opportunities in things like rare earths, which we all know are rare, as their name suggests, and which we want to develop a supply chain of, and they exist in the Arctic. But you also said, but it's a little more costly because we have to build a re-refinery so that we're not going in there to get it, that we're not polluting it. And so all this stuff costs money, and so it seems like one of the things that's given me hope about what you're saying is that, as things become more scarce, there's going to be greater and greater opportunity in the Arctic, and I think that's generally what we hear. But just to bring it back to something, I'll go to the fire motif. That this is a fireside chat, and I'll hold your feet to the fire just a little bit, but hopefully not too much. Before this, when we were talking, you mentioned that one of the ways you got interested in the Arctic was when you were at the Alaska Permanent Fund, that they set a goal for a percentage of their fund that they wanted to invest locally. And I was just wondering if you could tell everyone, I thought that was a really interesting and instructive story, and I was wondering if you could maybe share that, what happened and what the goal was with everyone here, if that would be all right.
So the Alaska Permanent Fund, a fund that I love, as does Mead, has generally not invested in Alaska, nor in Arctic opportunities. So, and you think it's a creature of something which is completely Arctic oriented, the North Slope superbasin of oil and natural gas. But that oil was responsible for creating the sovereign wealth entity, and as you know, we write a check in Alaska to every man, woman, and child in the state. They get a check. We knew we arrived because there's in the Simpsons movie there was a reference to the permanent fund check. So it was "Welcome to Alaska. Here's your check." It was said to Homer, and Homer says "About time" and grabs the money. But so the better case in this sense, is there as successful as the permanent fund has been internationally, has not invested in its own region. The Alberta Heritage Fund faced a similar issue, which is they wanted to have some of their sovereign wealth for the province or provincial wealth to invest back into something with the economy, to help develop your economy. And an initial goal was set at 2% of the Alberta Heritage Fund to invest back into provincial opportunities. And there was some hemming and hawing and complaining from the investment staff, will we be able to find enough investment opportunities? But the board itself set a target, 2%. 2%, and we'll see how it works at a 2% allocation. And they got to 2%, and what happened was that the investment staff, after they actually went out hunting and finding out ways that they could invest productively in their province, realized that they actually had an advantage. They had better information. They weren't sacrificing their returns. They actually had some better returns. The fund today is at 8%. The Alberta Heritage Fund is at 8% invested in provincial opportunities. So the target was 2%. There was again hemming and hawing from the investment staff. To get to 2%, they're at 8%. It was not a sacrifice for the fund. So in Alaska, we kind of have just begun this process. The permanent fund was launched in 1977 after a period of 7 years where the oil revenues, royalties were just spent by the government. And then the people of Alaska realized that unless they created a sovereign wealth entity, they would just keep on spending everything. So it was founded in 1977. Permanent Fund Corporation founded in 1982. Dividends started flowing in 1982. And Now the challenge is to invest into Arctic and Alaska opportunities. The same 2% target has been set for the permanent fund. So we'll see if it can follow the path of the Alberta Heritage Fund.
Right. And one of the reasons why I like that story so much was that it suggested that when people start to look locally, they have a sort of competitive advantage because they know some of the opportunities. They don't have to wait for the deer to knock because if they're living there, they experience it. And as there's more and more, I think, conferences like this to think about the Arctic and opportunities, it seems like we'll start to identify some of these opportunities altogether. But I wanted to ask you another question, which is, when you look around, you came from Norway, and I'm wondering if there are places like Norway or other examples we can look to that sort of help come up with a path forward so we can figure out what some sort of development path could look like for the Arctic, where investments could flow first, and what could be unlocked if they flowed in a certain order.
So part of the, I think there is a sequence, but I think it varies by region. When the minister, I think, is insightful. If you're in Greenland, mining is an inescapably interesting opportunity. If you're in Iceland, mining is not so interesting. Other things are interesting. They have very low energy costs because they have volcanoes. They have, and they have very inexpensive geothermal power. So it creates a different opportunity. So all the opportunities associated with very cheap power. So data centers become actually interesting, and other associated energy-intensive things. So I think the opportunities are regionally specific. I was just in Norway. The Nordic countries I thought would be, because we use the term Nordic countries, they're going to be similar in how they view the Arctic. Well, as it turns out, they're completely different. Norway is an Arctic economy. It is from transit purposes. They're part of the. If there is increased transiting from the Far East to Europe over Russia, then transiting over Norway is becoming a big deal. The use of LNG imported from Siberia, from Yamal, becomes interesting. Next door in Sweden, there's a view that they are not an Arctic country. I know, they're right next to each other. How can this be? Sweden they don't consider themselves an Arctic country. They don't want to invest in the Arctic. They want to point toward Europe. Finland also doesn't have like Sweden doesn't have direct access to the Arctic. They consider themselves an Arctic economy, and they have an impressive fleet of icebreakers. You need a little bit of like a scorecard to keep track of who's willing to be an investor, who's willing to be an industrial partner, and I think the priorities are a little different. What I am noticing, and this is a change from when I was at the permanent fund, even in a few years ago, is that the Arctic economies are talking to each other and coordinating a lot more. Conferences like this are a good example. And this conference is mimicked by several other conferences throughout the Arctic. And this hadn't happened. This is a relatively new dialogue that we're hearing and seeing. And I'm seeing, it's already leading to a degree of cooperation, which is pretty impressive. So I'm actually really enthusiastic for what I'm seeing as the cross-fertilization of things. By the way, in this typology of who consider themselves part of the Arctic economy and who isn't, because the Sweden-Norway thing was not intuitive to me at all. Like why? The state of Maine considers themselves much more of an Arctic economy. This is at the Arctic Circle conference. There were 50 people from the state of Maine, including the governor, of the state of Maine. You have something really interesting in terms of who's a player and who's not a player. State of Maine is a player in the Arctic economy. They see themselves linked to the route to Greenland, to Iceland, to the Nordics. Frankly, after 200 years of getting the short end of the stick with New York and Boston, they seem to.
Down there.
Yeah, exactly. They kind of have, and it's who would have thought? So I do find this, these alliances I think are actually very important. I think when the economies just were individualistic, trying to survive and do things on their own, it's different when they move in combination. So what changed the game with Maine was Icelandic maritime transit capabilities setting up shop in Portland, Maine. And it was and it changed how the state viewed itself with respect to the Arctic, and in a really positive way.
Well, that's very heartening. So, I think do we have enough time to open it to questions?
Yeah, open it up for questions, and I just feel like because
Yeah.
my thing, I get to ask one really quick. But just to round off a little bit of this discussion, which has been really fascinating, and when you're talking about the permanent fund in Alaska and reinvesting back in Alaska, and of course I'm thinking, in my mind maybe like pension funds in Canada, and what role is the possibility there for them to play. Can you give, because you're saying though what we're lacking is we need to develop this package, and when you talk around the world about and I've noticed and I feel that a lot of the institutional investor space, it's kind of like these trends, and they jump on these trends, and so at some point there's always a tip in the scale, and some place becomes a place, and then suddenly it's an emerging economy. It's where everyone wants to put their money, and like you're saying, a lot of money is going right now into Africa. But really, where are those returns on investment? They're not to be seen, or we don't know, or how they're going to evolve. So it's not necessarily then, if I'm understanding, that the return on investment needs to be so clear, as much as we need to develop the package. And it's this package that people need to be able to understand and to buy into. Can you just maybe what are the three? Are there three like criteria or pieces that the package includes that that need to be that need to go into
For institutional investment, I think there is a set of three criteria which generally is needed. One is the pure investment piece, namely the production of regularized income. I think it was mentioned earlier about having an environment of very low bond yields. So infrastructure and real estate worldwide have been beneficiaries of what used to be the realm of bond investment. That if you were an institutional investor, you have growth aspirations and you have income needs, and the income was provided by bond investing. That role, with very low interest rates, that need is still there for income, but it's not being met in nearly the same way by bonds. So infrastructure and real estate have been beneficiaries. That's sort of the good news, that infrastructure and real estate investment have a great deal of potential income flows, including to the Arctic. So the production of regularized income well above a bond yield, that's one criteria. The second is the local environment. I think it has to be supported by the local communities. The one thing that you sort of see is that if there's not local support, it matters. It matters politically. You never want to do an infrastructure investment that compromises sort of the integrity of what the local people are looking for. So the local people should actually be, it's a criteria, is there local support? The opposite of a NIMBY, not in my backyard problem. If you have anything like a NIMBY problem, that is problematic, extra problematic, I think, for the Arctic. And the third is the environment. The Arctic is a place where environmental degradation can last longer. If you have particulate matter from diesel fuel, I'll give the example of something that Meade knows well, the air quality in the wintertime in Fairbanks, Alaska. The air quality in Fairbanks. It is not a pretty picture. 100,000 people, it's not a small town, 100,000 people. Use of wood. Wood's great. Wood stoves are great. 100,000 people with wood stoves, not great. Inversions that occur. The air quality in Fairbanks in the middle of winter can be a horror show. Things do not dissipate in the same way. They don't dissipate in the same way that they do in temperate or in tropical environments. So I think the environmental impact, it's not, there's the reflex that it's a CO2 emissions issue, but the particulate matter is an extra problem. So I'd say those are the three criteria that we sort of look at, that be transformative in terms of the utilization of natural resources, energy and materials, move in concert with the development needs and desires of the local people, employ them. You know, one of the, like, don't, in the cases of where we had in Africa, you wouldn't want to bring in 10,000 Chinese workers to do something that the locals could do. And that primary one, make sure that the investment returns have to be sufficient. And governments can play a pretty important role for creating the mechanisms for helping to contain the risks and make the investments look attractive.
Very interesting. All right, some questions over here.
How would you characterize the legal and judicial systems? Is there any barriers for investment point when you compare Greenland with Canada and Alaska? Is there any need to adjust our systems to accommodate the investment, or if we are to attract more attention and to attract investments from U.S.?
So the short answer is we should be talking later on in the conference about this. So we need to make sure we do that. And yes, we've learned some things from. So I was a chief investment officer for a sovereign wealth entity and for a pension fund, but also for a development investor. When I was in the Middle East, the Gulf Investment Corporation's mandate was to develop the economies of that region, and so to diversify and to grow the economies of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, Oman, and Bahrain. And we did learn some things. And interestingly enough, in the Greenlandic context, there are some things that actually had begun to happen. One of the Permanent Fund in Alaska is a wonderful institution, a sovereign wealth entity. Sovereign wealth entities operated well and also that receive sufficient funding can be an incredibly valuable thing to a place like Greenland. And there is a mining fund, I know, that was launched, small today. That mining fund, with dispensation from Denmark for it to exist and for mining revenues and royalties to accrue to Greenland, could be a very big positive. So I have looked a little bit at this. One of the lessons that happened in the Middle East, which was an important one, was they did something that Alaska did not do. After a few decades where they simply had foreign companies come in and operate, and there was resource extraction from the Middle Eastern economies, and they took an initiative that they didn't want to toss out the foreign companies, But they knew that if they just let foreign companies set the agenda, then the priorities wouldn't be consistent with the national priorities. So one of the most important things, and maybe the difference is if you go to Abu Dhabi today and you go to Anchorage, Alaska, I, for one, as a creature of both places, get very frustrated. I think of Alaska. Alaska has all the resources that Abu Dhabi has. More. They are not the same economies. What happened particularly in UAE and Kuwait and Qatar is that the national priorities were set by the countries. They didn't let ExxonMobil determine what was going to be, what was going to be the priority. So in particular, value-added enterprises. They said that, well, instead of just being mined and all the value-added happening in other places, they were going to have some value-added things too, upstream and downstream. I would say that that's a relative weakness in Alaska. That in Alaska, we didn't get the value-added lesson as well as we should have. So I think there are lessons from the resource-rich parts of the world, good lessons and bad lessons that can accrue to Greenland. And I think the national priority part is being able to set your national priorities and particularly with value-added enterprises is one of the most important pieces.
Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I really believe that you were dead on in terms of your 5 target areas. One of the things that I experience a lot in the Arctic region in Canada when you talk about investment is the lack of infrastructure is often a huge deterrent. It drives the cost for every investor. And even in government, and I know you talk about government being the primary investor, then the developer or those who have direct invested interests, and then those who need to fund those developments. I find where we get stopped is right at go most times, because what's happening is you look at an area like Nunavut where you have 25 diesel generated stations in 26 communities. You look at my riding, you have 24 diesel generated 24 communities out of 30 that are on diesel generation. In both areas, you have major mining developments in iron ore, nickel, and gold that are all being run on diesel generated power. So just for them, the cost of just running the operation, not talking about transport to market, not talking about the cost of fly in and fly out of all the people they need in those operations in the remote locations. So they have to work twice as hard to raise capital for those operations. Every mine has to have a better quality, a higher quality. It has to be a better market value in trading stock. So all of these things becomes a deeper challenge in trying to move a project. So where I sit today, now that we've finally got one wall that says the north, we don't have a room yet, but we have a wall that says the north. So, you get to that wall and there's a limit. So there's a limit where the government of Canada will go in terms of their investment, not just the government I'm a part of, but every government in our history. Fortunately, it's probably going to be governments in our future. It's up to all of us to change and educate and work harder to make that change. But so in order for industry in the north to even compete, there has to always be a carve out. In order for a community in the north to even get ahead, there has to be a carve out. So in Canada, we've been able to implement in the last couple of years, some may agree, some may disagree, but programs like the Infrastructure Bank, which is an investment entity, transportation corridors, which is allowing us to get a resource to market, get people and goods trading in a more affordable way, more efficient way. If we did not have northern carve-outs on any of those programs, we would get left behind again. And even with those carve-outs, the limits are small. They look big, maybe to urban Canada, and maybe to a lot of other people, but the reality of doing business, they are very small. So there's always a limit. So no matter where I sit, you talk about rare earths in Greenland, we have huge deposits of rare earths, actually right next to my hometown where I grew up. And the legislation change that we just made in Canada is going to be very helpful in us moving rare earths to the next stage of development, production, and export. We would not be able to do it without this new policy change that we just implemented. However, it's like every other resource development sector, every other industry, it comes with tremendous challenge. So what I'm saying to you is that we have to change mindset all the way around. Every single step of the way. And you talk about the external investment companies that you're a part of. How do we bridge that gap? How do we get them to where we need them to be? So we're focusing on all three prongs at once. You know, I've had companies in my area had great developments in uranium. We dropped it like that. Dropped it just like that. They didn't want to deal with indigenous land claims. They didn't want to deal with environmental reviews under 3 sets of legislation.
And the logistics and the coal.
The logistics, the coal, the cost of no
absolutely.
transportation, no communications. So anyway, they move on. They go to Africa, Australia, wherever, and they buy out all these deposits and they leave it. They lay off, the 300 people that are there. They shut down the operation, and they say, it just costs too much. We can't do this right now. And so, and that's only one example. And there are dozens of them all over Canada's north, and many different sectors, not just in mining, but in many different sectors. So I guess my question to you, who's in that investment pool, how do I bring you to where I am? How do I bring you to those communities, those people who are want to partner and see more being done in the north? And so I'd just like your advice on that, because there's a huge gap in all three areas.
So there's bad news and there's good news. And the bad news is what you described is true across the entire Arctic. In exactly the terms that you have stated. If you go to Alaska, you would fit really well. If you go to a good portion of it, and the implication, the tough news there is that Greenland with mining resource, second to none potentially. These are things that don't. We have enough evidence that the free market by itself will not easily gravitate to developing these opportunities. The role of government becomes more important. The de-risking of pre-development money becomes super important. I'd say some basic infrastructure and pre-development money. Once you have something packaged, what does an institutional investor need? Well, if things are packaged in a way where the pre-development money has taken place and the logistics have been solved, you've solved actually the major components of what you need to get institutional investment, because then there's a pretty credible path to how you get regularized cash flows. Until then, it becomes very nebulous. The mining resource, I keep on going back to Greenland, the mining resource in Greenland was in some sense known for a long time. It's not a new discovery that Greenland has lots of mining resources. It's been known for at least a century. Some things are more important now. The fact that there's a titanium vanadium beach, a black beach, is sort of, you can't make it up. That sounds really interesting, in Greenland, but and more important now than in the past. But I would say that the pre-development money, help with logistics, the creation potentially of first loss positions. Governments can do some very interesting things. We've seen the use of first loss positions in Asia for the development of certain natural resources. First loss positions are very interesting because they can be a small amount of money that's provided by government, but it can be catalytic for providing major institutional investment to come in. And I think these are the sorts of partnerships that mean a lot to an institutional investor. So I'd say so you're thinking in exactly the right terms, and the governments and industrial companies they each have a different role, but they're critically important. Oh, and like with mining resource, so mining companies are the ones who actually do mining. Institutional investors, we don't do mining. I mean, we can invest in mining, but we have no pickaxes and shovels, nor do we know how to do it. We just have capital. So there is a role for each of these three, and I think you're underscoring this important thing that without the government role of being able to change the game on pre-development money and the infrastructure, nothing happens. Nothing will happen.
So let me just underscore, it's a rich conversation, the last two questions, and the role of government. To this government, the federal government's credit in Canada, it has pledged to eliminate the infrastructure gap between north and south in a decade, which does not mean that anybody really knows how big that infrastructure gap is, both in a contextual sense and an absolute sense. And you were pointing out, Yvonne, a huge difference in context. So the role of government, not just in terms of research, but in terms of driving basic infrastructure, is fundamental. I think you mentioned the infrastructure bank. John Casula is going to be here tomorrow to talk about its role and things like that. But I'm particularly struck by your point about the degree to which the North is coordinating to an extent that it didn't before. I was in Nuuk in August. You can't get there from here. You go to Reykjavik, it's a long way back from Reykjavik. There was a day when you could get there. We were talking about that. As the crow flies from the Iqaluit to Nuuk, it's not actually that far. It's a long way to try to get there otherwise. And I wonder how we can encourage, especially when everybody to varying degrees has that challenge with regard to infrastructure, north and south, greater coordination. And who's doing that, and who's looking to, in a structural way, the relationship between government and private sector flows, including institutional capital. Is the Arctic Council doing anything along those lines, or it's just and others,
I think
because the need for coordination and the common challenge, even if it varies greatly, seems to me obvious. One other point that I would say is the point you made about the permanent fund, the degree to which it doesn't invest at home, is also true of what you might call sovereign wealth funds in Canada that come out of the land claims agreement, in which there's relatively small investment at home as well. Maybe there's an opportunity for coordination there too, to think about it.
So I think there are a couple of points, and it actually gets to something I didn't mention. The coordination piece, one involves, you mentioned the fuels, diesel, the ubiquitous use of diesel fuels in small communities. The coordination piece there is likely linked to maritime transit. If you're moving the type of fuel from maritime transit to other things that are cleaner, you use that as you're coordinating the changes in maritime fuels with how you're heating the local communities. So if you're using diesel for both, and you're driving a change in the maritime fuels, try to use that as your leverage point. You want to coordinate different themes at the same time. But I do think I mean, I've been really struck by this extra coordination because these economies were they were friendly in some ways for a long time, but they didn't really coordinate. And I do think it's the Arctic Council and other things that are they're the right places. You know, they're beginning to do it. They're probably, you know, they probably don't get all the priorities right, but I think they're the right institutions. You know, and it's the interest that I'm seeing is. I use the case of Maine as an example. You know, which is it's striking. You know, when there were 50 people from Maine at an Arctic conference, including the governor, is making a statement like this is a serious. Like, it's not just about Maine. That they are looking to. It's an outreach. You know, where they would like to have offshore wind as a major resource using Maine technologies into places like Scotland and the Nordic region. It's sort of so you know, I sort of, in addition to maritime transit, so I do think that maritime transit might be actually one of the gateways to coordinating among. It's naturally multinational, and but it is. I do think that's probably a linchpin for us.